Just like to start with, this is probably more one for you guys. Physiology and training strategy. What's the easiest way to improve aerobic fitness for rowing?
So I start with this one, Sam.
Go on, jump in, mate.
The real truth to that answer is it's not easy, is it? It takes a lot of training. I think the key bit is the kind of organization of your training principles. So being able to make sure, number one, the first thing you have to do is train consistently. If you're not training consistently, you can forget about developing any kind of aerobic fitness. So consistency is very much king from that point of view. So you got to turn up on the regular if you want to make those gains. I think ultimately most rowers benefit from lapping up quite high volumes of training. High volumes of steady state training is ultimately the main way. And I think probably there's a bit of a misconception that if you're a masters athlete or someone who's only training 4 or 5 times per week, that means you shouldn't do any steady state training. But I don't think that's the case. But once you've got the consistency and building that volume is really important. And then everything else really flows from that. Sam, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or...
No, I thought it was very concise, mate. Anything I'd probably add is in terms of consistency, some people can get a little bit complacent or impatient and sort of jump onto the next training bandwagon, and you sort of then not having one of those central tenets of a training program of being consistent with your training. And I'd probably think using a plan, do, review cycle. So you plan what you're going to do with your training, you do it. So consistent over a 4 to 6 week block, you then sort of review it. And that's just quite a nice cyclical process to go through. So you're sort of keeping yourself honest and consistent with your training rather than just jumping onto the next thing that you see on Instagram, for example.
Definitely. I think part of the problem, particularly with stuff online at the moment, is everyone's looking for the easiest way to do something. And it's like, that's the good thing about sport, right? And particularly endurance sports is there's not really any shortcuts. You either put the work in, put the time in, or you don't. And that's essentially going to be the determining factor of where you get to. Cool. So next one, how can masters rowers, try to really pronounce that properly and not let my northern accent come in. How can masters rowers improve performance without increasing volume?
Do you want to start? Or?
I was going to say, Kieran, did you want to jump in with that one first?
Yeah, I'm happy to lead on this one. I'd say I've got quite a bit more experience with masters rowers over the past couple of seasons. So I think my answer would be 2 parts. Number one, strength training and mobility. I think particularly the masters rowers that I work with, particularly at Marlow Rowing Club, that's a group that I've been running their S&C for the last, nearly 2 years now. I think the improvements that they've made, not just in strength, but also just in how they're moving and everything they're doing has been enormous. And that's just from quite a basic, it's periodized, but it's not a complicated strength training program. And there is definitely a big focus on good quality movement, getting into the right positions, and particularly the first 6 months, we're doing a lot of slower tempo lifts and pause lifts, and just with a lot more focus on time under tension. I think that really benefited everything that they were doing. And then the other thing I would say, which I encounter with a lot of people, is just any sort of peak power training. I think that's kind of one of the first things to slip once you start getting into your later training age, and actually, just working on that peak power training, I think can really improve all of the other zones, all of the other intensities below that. And for me, I think that's definitely been one of the lowest hanging fruit that I've encountered with masters rowers, for sure.
I think you make a really good point, Kieran, because it's I find it really strange that in the masters community that there isn't an absolutely huge push for strength training, because ultimately when you're racing over 1K, it becomes such a bigger determinant in performance, and it's important anyway for Olympic rowing, let alone when we're racing half the distance. And as soon as you're getting into bigger boat categories, just the emphasis becomes more and more. I would probably add, echoing what you said around when you're able to improve someone's peak power output, the transfer that has is all about your rowing economy. So in a hypothetical sense, if someone's only got a max wattage of 600 and they have to row a race at 300 watts, then they're already rowing at 50% of what their maximum is. And as soon as you increase that ceiling to, say, I don't know, 1,000, hypothetical, we've put some big gains in, then you're rowing at 30% of what you're capable of. So it means you've got much more energy in the tank to use up during the race. So I think it's such a critical area for masters guys to think about strength training.
Absolutely.
I'd echo that in terms of that, relating it to like even junior Olympic programs, where we're consistently trying to raise that ceiling. As you say, in that example, like the 600 and 300 watts there, the 600 watts is someone's sort of ceiling. And it's what are the determinants of trying to push that ceiling further on. And then even outside of a performance lens, in masters rowers, range of motion scores and strength for me go hand in hand. You improve one, you're typically going to help improve the other one, and strength you're going to work through range anyway. So I think you're going to improve the top end, but even sort of broadening that out to general life outside of rowing, I think you're going to notice those gains as well. We talk around strength training impacting bone mineral density and other things around joint mobility, for example. I'd like to think that someone entering 2 or 3 S&C sessions a week alongside a good aerobic base is going to reap huge amounts of rewards sort of just outside of performance, but as well as performance. And you almost have this process of you feel better outside of the sport, you then come back into the sport in a way better place.
Definitely. So kind of just going to probably cherry pick a few of these. I guess there's quite a few here about zone 2 training, that kind of thing. I feel like there's people probably get overloaded with information about that. So next one I'm going to go for, what's the most underrated metric for tracking progress?
Kieran, maybe you should start with this one.
I'm going to go with RPE. I think that there's probably not too many, but I think that people get so focused on data-driven progression that I think sometimes people can lose sight of how it feels. And I think there's many ways to track your progress. I think we always like to see more load on the bar, more watts on the ergo, but equally that can be faked by your programming. If somebody's saying, here's 1% extra and these are the splits that I want you to do, then actually that progressive overload is not necessarily a real thing. There is some element of that, but I'd say that probably one of the most underrated metrics I'd say is just, are you doing the same as last time, but for a lower RPE? So RPE is a rate of perceived exertion. And I think that A, it's good because it's something that you can track, but B, I think it also just puts you in tune with yourself and how you feel about training and how you're supposed to feel in sessions. I think then that becomes something quite powerful, because if we then use RPE in conjunction with heart rate and power outputs for an aerobic session, then it's something that you can use to judge your effort a little bit on the day. And it's not always about going lighter. Sometimes it is about the RPE feels low today, so maybe I can push on a little bit. Or if you get halfway through a block of training and be like, well, these UT1 AT targets are probably not feeling like the right stimulus right now. It's then giving yourself the tools and the confidence to be able to go a little bit harder if you need to. So it can definitely swing both ways.
I'm a big fan of RPE. Another thing that I'd add, using that as a tool rather than heart rate or percentages of heart rate max, is that you can use an RPE for any session. So you've got your whole week planned out and you're doing a steady state UT2 session, you can give that an RPE. You can give an RPE to an S&C session, a robustness session, like a core or a strength session. Another area I'm a massive fan of is using the RPE in conjunction with the time. So you say, for example, you have like a UT2 session that's maybe a 2 or a 3 in terms of intensity out of 10. So it's like on the lower end, heart rate maybe around the 140 mark, but RPE of 2 or 3. And then you've done that for an hour. You times the RPE by the duration to give you what's called a training impulse score. And again, you can utilize that across any form of exercise or modality. And then when you're looking at your week, it might be actually that you could spend a little bit more time doing the UT2 and you have a similar RPE TRIMP score than you do if you're doing a 10 or a 15-minute block of pieces, for example. Obviously, the contribution of that is going to be different when we're talking about it physiologically, but I really do think that helps map out the week in terms of what your bigger days are generally using the training impulse score.
Definitely.
Yeah, nice. But I'm going to add you guys quite nicely about how important subjectivity is. I would say I'm going to go back to my science head and think a little bit about just what is currently done in rowing. And one of the things that is often done in rowing is a lot of guys training off split on the ergo, which in many ways is totally fine to do. But I think one of the mistakes that many people fail to recognize is that a split, you need incrementally a lot more work the quicker the split is. So, for example, if you have an open weight female who's trying to break 8 minutes on the ergo and they're going off at 2-minute splits, to drop from 202 to 2-minute splits is significantly less watts than a heavyweight male trying to go from 132 to 130 splits to pull a sub 6 minute ergo. And I think that's often a massive mistake, is around calculating a lot of your training around split and then giving that to a group of athletes and say you need to be -5 splits for this zone or this zone, because I really don't think it works out well. So I think that's a really key. I'm really keen on prescribing a lot of wattages. And sure, if people want to use split, then calculate from that, that's fine. But I think it's such a common error in the rowing community, not looking at wattage first and then looking at split rather than just looking at split.
And I think people or in my experience, I've found that people that will prescribe that, if it's like 2K plus 25, I think quite often those people will only work with one group of athletes. And if you get the head coach of a women's program, saying, okay, this is the difference in split that we're going to prescribe, it works great in their environment. But I think, again, part of that misconception in the rowing world is people don't work with enough of the different demographics in rowing. And I think then having that understanding of the difference between masters, juniors, men, women, and different age groups, different training ages, I think is really, really key for good programming, for sure.
Definitely.
Cool. So we'll got a few questions here about strength and conditioning. So I think probably you guys would maybe take the lead on this one. First one. So what lifts do you think, or is there opinion on it? What lifts should every rower be doing, regardless of age or experience?
Oh, Sam, you've got to start with this one. This is your bag.
My brain's going crazy. In terms of the question, you have to just like one single exercise.
I don't think one. I think that's definitely, again, another problem online is what's the best exercise.
Yeah,
we can't
true.
answer that, but what should be the staples of any strength training program, I guess?
For me, it's probably thinking about relating it back to the demands of the sport. So for me, you need to be able to access deep inner range hip flexion. Obviously, you think about that deep compressed position in the catch. And I think you need to be working through that range. Like we've talked around masters athletes accessing that strength through range, but for me, that's a commonality, a common principle that all rowers should be working towards. And that's why I wouldn't necessarily discourage people from doing partial quarter squats or anything like that. I think they have their place in a program. But for me, it's thinking bigger picture, that if you're going to do that, you need to be trying to hit that work through range somewhere else in your program. The sort of main area I think for me that gets typically missed is probably your trunk strength. And there's tons of literature out there sort of suggesting that there's X percentage of force that goes through the ankle, knee, hip, shoulder girdle, for example, and then ultimately onto the handle and onto the spoon. But for me, I think a commonality I see in programs, and even on some online programs, is missing the trunk and its sort of contribution of force transfer. So I think for me, I would probably say top end force potential through the trunk. Just rattle off a couple of exercises that I'm a big fan of, but things like your clean first pulls or deficit work, where you are getting athletes into that sort of deep compressed position. They're having to brace the trunk. And when I'm talking about that bracing of the trunk in that sort of position, I'm talking about how well the spine can resist that flexion. And for me, athletes that do that really well, typically when you see them out on the water, their spine doesn't deform. They're able to stay nice and tall, really sit well with good posture and form, whilst they're then transferring that force that their legs have really nicely generated through the trunk and then onto the handle through the shoulder. So there's definitely that connection piece of the trunk, shoulder and hip, which I think a lot of people just end up doing isometric holds or just really light work. And for me, rowing is quite a niche sport that, especially if you're in like a 4 and 8, for example, that the inertia that these guys are having to overcome on the mass of the hull on the water is pretty big coming off the line. So for me, you need to prepare athletes for that, and the only way to do that in my mind is top end force production through the trunk. But then of course on the other end of the continuum, we also need to have those isometric holds and tissue conditioning and trunk endurance. But for me, it's definitely the trunk strength and high force through the trunk, I think, is definitely a missed trick in a lot of programs.
Sam, I've got to echo what you say there around trunk strength. I think you see many rowers trying to bust out endless time of planks and very focusing loads on like supine scullers and loads of like sit up type work, loads of heavy anterior core endurance type work. And whilst that does have a place and it's definitely an important component, but you're totally right. If you want a forceful, effective stroke, you can have the best leg drive in the world, but if you haven't got a trunk that's able to to translate that force, then you're not going to accelerate the boat. And I think to echo what you said around, actually, when we've looked in some of the literature's looked in great detail about what rowers do, rowers compared that have back pain versus not having back pain, and what you said around maintain, it's not necessarily that they stay completely bolt upright all the time. Posture is actually quite variable amongst a lot of different levels of rowing in different categories, even regardless of females, males, lightweights, etc. But what they do is that actually through the leg drive that they hold that shape without deforming the trunk, even though it might not be absolutely completely perfect, this lovely glass aligned spine that we like to see. So I've got to agree with you. I think it's such a critical aspect, and really any rower of any level needs to think about how they're structuring their trunk training and including it as part of their S&C program.
100%.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm not going to add anything more. I think you guys are obviously the qualified ones in this, so I'm going to leave those answers with you guys. So let me just open these again. So a couple more questions on S&C. I guess this is probably a bit of a shorter one. What's one gym mistake that's holding rowers back? I think my input in this is not necessarily anything specific in terms of a lift or anything, but I'd say the one thing I would see is just rowers not committing to strength training and not necessarily understanding the importance. And I've seen a lot of good men and women coming into a gym and not really giving it the right intent and thinking that it doesn't matter and they can already make a boat go fast without it, which is true, and they have made boats go fast. But I think kind of echoes a lot of what you guys have just touched on in terms of, if you want to be able to move a boat even faster, then at some point there's going to have to be a lot of force going through the body, and you need to be robust enough to hold that. So I don't know what any of the more specific mistakes that you think might be holding rowers back at the moment.
Do you want to jump in first, James, or I'm happy to?
Yeah, I'll go first. But I would say I think you're absolutely right, Kieran. For me, I really see two groups of cohorts within that. So there's the group of people that you described that don't really give the respect for how much intensity has to go into strength training to get a lot out of it. Very much treat it like a tick box exercise and it's kind of done and I'm over with. But ultimately, the performance benefit, you've got to climb quite high up the tree to really get that. And I equally see the people that are quite well trained and the guys that I deal with day in, day out, and sometimes have the mistake that going always to failure in the gym is the best way to train. So it's like a double-ended sword from that perspective, but I definitely see a lot of that as well. And I think that's particularly more common probably with some of our highly motivated juniors that are trying to put as much weight on the bar as possible and failing every time when they're doing their bench or whatever it might be. And I think that can really stifle some of your gains. It can really affect how well you can recover from strength training and really get the adaptation, because you don't get stronger in the session, you get stronger after the session. And I think it can ultimately lead to quite a vicious cycle where we're just kind of overtraining and not getting that benefit.
Definitely.
I'd 100% agree with that, and I think that's probably, I'd agree, that the biggest sort of failing of people coming in and just going all guns blazing. And just, if I program, for example, 4 sets of 8 at like a 70%, I see people failing, then they've overcooked the prescription or not gone to what is actually 70% 1RM, for example. And definitely echo what you said there, James, and nicely highlighted that. For me, it's, if you're going max every time and you are failing reps, then you're probably going to end up blunting that adaptation. But I'd actually go further to say that you're not only going to blunt the adaptation there from an S&C perspective. If you're going through a block of training where S&C isn't your primary objective, you're probably going to end up spending tokens elsewhere that you actually want to spend on the next session being pieces. Or if you're out in the water doing an erg session, you're just going to end up burning yourself out for the next session. Doesn't really matter how much refueling you're going to do. Your body's probably going to respond pretty negatively to going all guns out the whole time. So it's probably about training smarter, not necessarily harder, and sort of being really tactical with where you are spending those tokens.
I think that's something I've seen with athletes as well. I think perhaps that kind of group that I mentioned at the start is quite often the viewpoint from those guys is like, oh, I don't want to push too hard in the gym because I'm going to get sore and that will affect my next rowing session. But then kind of like, well, I guess as we've talked about, getting that kind of training intensity right in the gym, and if you make that first step up towards that, then you might be a little bit sore for a week or two, but ultimately, what's the long-term goal, right? How do you want to be able to lift weights better, but just if you're going to be able to train consistently, be more robust, put down more force in the boat, then at some point there's got to be a bit of external resistance from the weights that you have to work against.
Kieran, I'd probably say that this comes down to actually having a decent program, right? If you're worried about what the gym is going to do to you the day after, because you're concerned about your performance on a training session, then I think you have to look at your whole program and ask yourself, well, should I be concerned every single day I go out rowing about how fast I'm going? Because if I am, then I've got my priorities wrong. You need to have a long, hard look at how your program is actually fitting in with what your objectives are.
Definitely. Cool. So I've got the next section of questions that I've picked up is, again, comes back to a lot of what's the number one, what's one cue, what's one thing. I think like to avoid those because I think as I said earlier, everyone's kind of looking for a quick fix almost. And I guess just to reinforce that point of there are no shortcuts basically. And anyone who tells you there are is probably trying to sell you whatever the shortcut is. So good one I've got here is how do you know if your training is actually working? Quite a broad question.
That's a great one. I'll jump in. I think I referenced this earlier at the start of the podcast in terms of the plan do review, and that's something we do at an Olympic level. That's things that our S&Cs and sports scientists practitioners do in the development and pathway space, because that's ultimately how we sort of look at progression. You sort of come together as a team, we plan what the groups are going to do, whether it's in the development space or working with gold medalist athletes. You still plan the session, the blocks, and so on, and then you then deliver the session to the athlete. We then do that consistently over 4 to 6 weeks, and then to assess that, we obviously might do that in a slightly different way in terms of the assessment tools that we may use at a junior or development level, and then obviously with Olympic medalists. But it's still that same process of a plan do review cycle multiple times over 2, 3, 4 years if we're working with the top guys. But it's essentially that consistency of that cycle. And even if we're only adding 0.5% of each of those cycles, that compounds massively over each 4-year cycle. Or if you're working gearing up each season, that's still huge percentage change over the course of the season.
Yeah, my view on that is, or not on that specifically, but on this specific question is just around kind of a bit of perspective. I think that people there's a danger with some athletes if you get so caught up in the here and now, and obviously the here and now is important, and you'll be present with training. But I think it's just being accepting and just getting idea that you're going to see linear progress on a day-to-day basis or a weekly basis. And I think just being able to zoom out and bigger picture, and with a lot of my one-to-one clients, as I'm sure you guys do, there's a lot of graphs involved, and never go straight up. There's some undulation, right? And part of that is to go with the periodization of the program. But I think it's just what you're doing and having a bit of perspective, I think is really, really important to be able to see that it's working, and just like focusing on positives. Because a lot of athletes in my life, 2 days of training where you haven't necessarily seen a improvement, and all of a sudden it's kind of doom and gloom, and then that negatively affects the next 3-4 days, when actually have been on a more consistent run of training if you've just been a little bit more open-minded and had that little bit more perspective on it.
Yeah, I outlined it really nicely. I mean, things there are all centered around managing what your expectations are for your objectives, and doing it like you do, Sam, in terms of that plan do review cycle. Or it might be like ultimately set yourself a goal. 9 times out of 10, that is a performance orientated goal. Technical performance, physical, physiological, it doesn't really matter. And goal is down the line. You have to look at yourself and review and say, have I achieved that or not? And that for me is how we know we're getting better. And you're right, Kieran, it's not every day. Look at it every single day. It's about the bigger picture, and that is some things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis when you're trying to develop, but that's not I must go faster every single day. It might be I need to work on this small technical aspect, and you're trying to keep reminding yourself of that every day, but ultimately it leads to a bigger picture of feed. And for me, I think it's really important that those goals are fixated, that they are relative to yourself. I think many athletes will say, well, I want to be, I want to win this or win that. And in some ways, those things are very much out of your control. But if you can kind of down further and go, okay, well, be Olympic champion, I need to be able to achieve a boat speed of this. Okay, what boat speed? How long down the line do I need to be able to achieve that? Out where do I need to be 2 years out? Where do I need to be? That's the more clear thinking that you need to have as an athlete, and particularly someone who wants to progress in a sport like rowing.
Definitely good answers there. So kind of a couple of questions about coaching style and philosophy. So another nice open one. What do you love most about coaching?
Kieran, you should start with the main rowing coach.
Yeah. For me, just my almost is just helping people. Personally, rowing's a huge amount for me in my life. I think that, I guess, from coming from where I started before I was rowing, I was kind of next to no self-discipline, kind of no real direction. And I think that rowing provided a kind of platform for me to, get better at something, like the fact that it was quite honest. Like you said earlier, if you're prepared to put the hours in, you're probably going to see some benefits. And I quite like the fact that it was okay, it doesn't necessarily matter what your background is, rich, poor, old, young, whatever, the kind is there for you to be able to put the work in. And I think from what it did for me, that's why, although I really value being able to other people, I'd say more so in the online world, one thing I encountered when I first started out as an athlete and a coach was just a complete lack of information, and I'd say, gatekeeping as well. So, okay, obviously stuff I want to get paid for and we want to get paid for with this program that we're running, but, put a lot of value into just helping people. And, there's a lot of people out there that I think need a lot of guidance or would value a lot of guidance. I think just providing that for people to kind of find that super rewarding. I'd say more specific to rowing, the thing I get most excited about, in a season, is either with individuals or crews, is the time you see kind of almost there's always the performance at the World Championships, or there's always the performance on a 2K or a 1K. But I think it's the first session that you have, and it's time, you're 1500 and you're on kind of deemed to be gold medal pace, as you were talking about a second ago, James. Or a client today messaged me, and his first set of 500s, and he was like, oh wow, I'd like a sub 7 is within touching distance, and he really clearly happy about that. And I was because even though he's the one who put all that work into those sessions, it's amazing he's now started to see that, and that kind of magic, I guess, a little bit for himself. And I think then once you see a bit of that, you really start to get that belief. I think athletes and the crews for themselves, but I think for you as a coach, and that's what most out of me, as soon as I start to see, well, not that you haven't put the effort in before, but it's that's what really builds that momentum when you start kind of a world championships or a World Cup, or even if it's just an individual performance. I think that it's almost, that's when you start to make that step from training up to performing. And I think those two are very different things, and it definitely requires a bit of a shift in the mindset and a shift in the intent. Once you know that set date at the end, when I'm doing the test, this I know what time the race is going to start for this heat, this semi, at least then it's okay, it's now. And then you start to kind of towards that. And winters particularly, that's what kind of keeps me going, is I know at some point that I'm going to come again, and that's what gets me super excited about moving up towards a big event.
Now, we had a deep insight there into your.
That was awesome. There's so passion in there for
You guys.
Yeah, I think definitely listening to you there's a lot that resonates, and I think working with obviously the online stuff, either an athlete or group of athletes, and obviously my current day job leading the programs at British Rowing, I think there's, for me, that sense of belonging within a team and working towards a sort of shared vision or shared goal, and so that might be trying to forge the next Olympic champ, or sometimes it might be development athlete that actually their goal is to break it into the senior Olympic or Paralympic team, and to be able to help out on both elements of that. And for me, that's incredibly rewarding to help someone realize that one. Again, there's probably some stories and bits and pieces in around that, but for me it's definitely that collective work, I guess, whether it's within the sports science team or if it's S&C discipline itself, and trying to help someone push on. But even bigger than that, it's probably just being part of a team and for me, the opportunity to work with people. Whilst I'm sure James maybe feels the same way. Whilst it's sort of you are a strength and conditioning coach, and there's that sort of that coaching element within our roles. It's probably the reason why I do the job is to sort of work with people. Obviously, I'm a massive nose around numbers, and who isn't around strength training helps. Yeah. But for me, it's front and center about the people.
But you want to have your thighs, you got to be a nose around the numbers, mate. That's great, Sam. I would say, I was trying to think whilst you guys were answering, actually, if I do this, what is it that really motivates me? And the first thing that came to my head was just so I can avoid being sat at a desk all day. I don't think it's just
the irony.
I think for me, how I really think about it is anytime you've watched like amazing events on TV, whether it be, take for example, super, won a rowing medal apart from the past 8 years where I've been in Switzerland. All the moments of sport where like you on the TV shouting at the TV, come on, that incredible feeling. I feel like coaching and helping people in that journey is like that on steroids. It's just like when you played a small part in helping someone be really successful, it is such an incredible feeling. And I think you're right, Sam, that doesn't extend to just the high performance end. It goes across all facets, whether it's, get back into the sport, whether it's, little goals, win day out as a team, a good project up and running for some whatever it might be. Like, I feel like that is the key component of it for me.
Very good. That's I think I know you guys even better now, which is nice. I mean, there's a lot of other good questions, but I feel like we probably could fill a whole other podcast on some of these questions that I've picked up and that people have sent in. So I'll just end on one, I guess, to tell a bit more about us. If you weren't involved in rowing or coaching rowing, what sport would you like to work in, or what would you like to coach?
Oof, that is tough.
I'm happy to start with that one because I always say the same answer, but definitely in F1. I feel like the coach, personal trainer for any of the drivers. I think that would be my job. I think because you kind of a lot of what you get in rowing in terms of like when they're at home, you kind of demands of the sport to meet. But I think love to get stuck into like the way and the race, help them with all of the kind of exercises they have to do, maybe kind of their ear a bit when they're in the middle of the race. I think, and to obviously travel all over the world. I think that, like, for me, that would be the dream to get into that position for sure.
I know a few mates, so I'll hook you up if you want. Don't worry. Well, I'll get you the contacts. Don't worry.
Yeah,
it's like you've like thought about pretty.
Yeah, I'm on the pathway or anything, but I've thought about it quite a bit. Yeah. How about you guys?
Sam, do you want to go? Or?
I want to need some more thinking time, mate. I'm struggling.
Right, okay. I always feel like I always used to give like a simple answer to this question, and it was probably rugby, and just because there's one culture that I love, like the core aspect of rowing that I love is the hard work ethic amongst the group. Particularly Sam with the open weight men and GB. It's such a fantastic group, and like there's some rugby banter in there as well, which helps carry you through the long days, which makes a massive difference. But it's that culture of hard work that I think makes a big difference. And, I also love that about rugby, but with the fact that rugby then combines so many different facets of like strength, power, of physiology, of tactical, of psychological, and like it's a beautiful blend, I feel, of those few things. But I think I'm such a, I'm going to use your words, Sam, sport nose, that I will happily work with anyone in anything, like anything from lawn bowls to darts. Like it like joy just watching different types of sports. So like in reality, I'll work with anyone, mate. Doesn't matter who it is. You tell me. Dog trainers, I'll work with them. Doesn't matter.
As long as they want to get better at something.
Exactly.
Well, to be honest, I think like another reason that I have valued coaching so much is that I feel like anything that I now do in my life, I just apply like the framework and strategy that I would use to get better at something in sport. And I think like, again, another reason I think I'm like so about coaching is just like, often says this of like, playing darts or bowling or something. It's just like, a little bit of advice, all of a sudden it'd be better. And she's always like, wow, you could literally coach anything. And it's like, I guess once you know what to look out for, and I guess I almost my coaching style is like just like what's the essence of movement that you're trying to do, like what's the kind of facets of it that I'm going to trump anything else, 90% that's going to make the biggest difference. I think then actually whatever you do, I think can definitely take you a long way. And I guess a lot about like the problems in rowing. I think almost like the overarching one that I see is just like people get so obsessed with like the details of twice a week, and they're like, right, what should I wear on the erg? Like I've Converse, I've got my Nike Roma layers, I've got these, and actually it's like you need to be worrying about any of that. Just like do your steady state, do your strength training, do your speed work, and keep doing that consistently, and you're gonna get a lot better basically. I think you're
about to get a load of hate in your inbox now because people are getting upset that you don't really care as much that if the wrists are completely flat at the finish or not.
Yeah. Don't get me started on the flat wrists. It's the biggest point of anger in rowing, I think. But it's nice to see people are passionate about these things.
Got to be passionate, haven't you?
Yeah, brings us to
other weightlifting shoes are available.
Well, I mean, I can't really comment because I think I'm on my 7th pair of lifters in the last 3 years. So, but that's mainly for the aesthetics. And actually, now I've stopped wearing them completely, and I've PB'd every single lift in the last 3 months. So
yeah, at the time, so I'm barefoot, mate.
Yeah.
Wow. Still rocking my wins, my red suede dough wins from 2011, I think. Those are going strong. Yeah. I'm on for the next one.
Built to last, yeah. Maybe
Definitely.
we can do next time, like elite review weightlifting shoes.
See how many hits we get.
Yeah, not sure it'd be too popular in the rowing world, but we'll probably
definitely not
from weightlifters.